Hi everyone. This is a big unit that will begin today. This is lectures 11, 12, and 13, which cover chapter 8. And this is antibody detection and identification, which is really an important topic. So we will spend some time today reviewing the steps. So I'm just going to get into slideshow. Okay. So for our objectives today, we will define atypical or unexpected antibodies and explain how they are formed. We will discuss the purpose of the antibody screen test and what results mean to the patient. Compare and contrast the autocontrol and direct antiglobulin test, also known as the DAT. Explain why patient information regarding transfusion or pregnancy history, age, race, and diagnosis help in the process of antibody identification, and describe the reagent red blood cell panel and antigram with regard to antigen configuration and ABO type. We will define phase of reactions and the significance, discuss how reaction strength contributes to antibody resolution, describe the process of rolling out antibodies on a panel, explain the rule of 3 with regard to antibody identification, list methods that can be used to help ID multiple frequency or high frequency antibodies, and describe the properties of a high titer, low avidity antibody and techniques for identifying or avoiding reactivity. We will also discuss the use of the pre-warming procedure, explain the process of identifying the specificity of a cold autoantibody and techniques to avoid reactivity, list methods of enhancing weak IgG antibodies, describe adsorption techniques as they apply to warm and cold autoantibodies, define the elution procedure, and list the methods and purposes of this test. Quite a bit. So here we go. We see our little cartoon character scratching his head. So we're going to start with antibody detection. So we'll begin with unexpected antibodies. So these are not naturally occurring antibodies like ABO. They are other antibodies that usually form only after an individual has received a transfusion of donor red cells from another individual, or in a woman following a pregnancy, because as we've talked quite a few times by now, the father of the child contributes his genetic information, and it's entirely possible that the fetus is carrying antigens on the red cells that originate from the father, so they would be foreign to the mother. Okay, so if the mother is exposed to those fetal red cells, there is a likelihood that she could develop antibodies against them. So these unexpected antibodies are also known as allo antibodies or allo antibodies. People say it both ways, whatever you prefer. And they are directed against antigens, as I said, present on either donor red cells or fetal red cells. Okay, so let's compare. Autoantibody is an antibody that would be formed against self, meaning I've formed antibodies to antigens that are present on my own red cells. Okay, so allo antibodies are antibodies that are formed and directed against antigens of the red cells of others, not my own. So the test that we use in the lab to determine if someone has an unexpected antibody or unexpected antibodies, which is entirely possible to have more than one, is called the antibody screen. So when is an antibody screen performed? On patients who are in need of a transfusion, on pregnant women, on patients who have had transfusion reactions, meaning they've been given donor red cells and they had a reaction to them, and also on individuals who donate blood and plasma to, for instance, in our region, it's the American Red Cross, and it's right down between 7th and 8th on Spring Garden Street near CCP. Okay, and so when you were doing your phlebotomy rotations, you may have heard type and screen. And so we already know about the type, which is ABO and Rh type, and the screen part is the antibody screen. So when we're performing an antibody screen, we use the patient's plasma or serum. Okay, just like we use the patient's plasma or serum in reverse ABO typing to see what naturally occurring ABO antibodies they have, we can use that patient's serum or plasma in the antibody screen test to determine if they have any unexpected antibodies. Okay, and so we also use reagent screening cells, and we're going to look at them again in a few minutes. So unexpected antibodies can be found in addition to the expected or naturally occurring antibodies that a person may have, the anti-A or anti-B, depending on their blood type. Unexpected antibodies are a result of red cell stimulation. Okay, so we established this on a previous slide. So if someone's exposed to red cell antigens from another individual, their body can recognize them as foreign and make antibodies against them. Okay. So unexpected antibodies can be clinically significant, and so when we talk about clinically significant, that means that they could have an impact on transfusion, and these are always, or I should say most often, class IgG, and they react at human body temperature, 37 degrees. Or sometimes individuals have clinically insignificant antibodies, and usually they are IgM, and they are clinically insignificant most often because they failed to react at 37. So we know that IgM typically reacts best at room temp or colder. Okay, so a little bit of this is going to be redundant, but you can't hear it too many times. It's very important to get it straight. So just remember, clinically significant antibodies are usually IgG. They react best at 37 because that's our human body temperature, and also during the antiglobulin phase of testing, okay, AHG, okay? And so as part of the antibody screen and also as part of antibody panel testing that we'll get to a little bit later, we do a phase of testing using anti-human globulin, and it's the indirect antiglobulin test, IAT, which we did get a chance to talk a little bit about with week D. Remember week D? Okay, so some of the clues or the tips that we learned for antiglobulin testing are going to be revisited. Clinically significant antibodies are associated with hemolytic transfusion reactions and hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn. And so it's important for us to identify them so we can take steps to avoid transfusion reactions and risk to the fetus. Okay, so when we're performing an antibody screen, as mentioned before, we take our patient's serum or plasma. We're going to have the number of tubes for the number of screening cells we're testing our patient with. And so screening cells sometimes come in sets of 2, or sometimes they come in sets of 3. Could be either way, okay? So typically in our student lab, we just order sets of 2. So if I had a screening cell 1 and a screening cell 2 that I was going to test my patient with, I would need 2 tubes for tube testing, one labeled screening cell 1 with the patient's ID, the second one patient ID with screening cell 2, and to each of those tubes I'm going to add 2 drops, just like reverse typing, 2 drops of my patient's serum or plasma into each tube. Then I'm going to add 1 drop of the corresponding screening cell. So 1 drop of screening cell 1 into that tube, 1 drop of screening cell 2 into that one. Okay, so when we're doing this in our student lab, we actually carry these tubes through 3 phases of testing. Okay, and we do that no matter what we get, no matter what result we get at a previous phase. We always carry through 3 phases of testing. Okay, so as soon as we add everything to the 2 tubes, similar to when we're doing our ABO and RH typing, we're going to give them a little mix and centrifuge them at immediate spin and read them, okay? So maybe at immediate spin, I'm going to get negative results. Maybe at immediate spin, I'm going to get some agglutination, which I would grade. We always grade our agglutination. But regardless of what I get, even if I get a positive, I'm still moving on to 37 degrees, okay? So what we're going to do next, we're going to add a drop or two of a potentiator. So maybe you recall LynnC, bovine serum albumin, PEG. These are potentiators that enhance reactions. And so we're going to add, 2 drops to each of my 2 tubes, and then I'm going to incubate those tubes at 37 degrees for a minimum of 15 minutes. Once that incubation time is over, I'm going to take those 2 tubes, and once again, I'm going to centrifuge and read them. And maybe they're going to be negative. Maybe I'm going to see some agglutination. If I see agglutination, once again, I grade the reactions, and I'm moving on to the last phase regardless of what I got, okay, at my previous phases. So the last phase of testing, the indirect antiglobulin test using anti-human globulin reagent, hopefully you all remember that whenever we use AHG, we have some important rules. Okay, so everybody, what do we always have to do before we add AHG? I'm waiting for you to respond. Anybody? I'm teasing. We always have to wash our tubes 3 to 5 times, okay? So we're going to take those 2 tubes, we're going to wash them in our cell washer with physiologic saline 3 times prior to adding AHG. And remember, that's to avoid neutralization of our anti-human globulin if there are any unbound proteins or complement present in those tubes, okay? So once we've washed them 3 times, we're going to add 2 drops of our AHG. Most labs are going to use polyspecific at this point. And then once again, we're going to centrifuge and read, and maybe we get negative reactions. Remember, any negative test with AHG, we have to confirm with check cells. Okay, maybe I get a positive, a 1+ or a 2+, okay? But the point being is these 3 phases of testing are always carried out regardless of what I got at the previous phase, okay? So the goal is to detect antibodies which react at 37 or AHG, because these are the ones that are clinically significant. So what I will say is, because we're learning about phases of testing, we will talk about immediate spin, and it's included in all of our examples from our textbook as well. When you all go to do a rotation in blood bank for your clinical, you're going to see that I would say 95% of blood bank labs do not perform testing at immediate spin for an antibody screen. And the reason is they're usually picking up IgM that isn't clinically significant at this phase. And so why bother? I don't want to know about it if it's not going to impact anything. So, but we will be looking at immediate spin phase just so you guys can learn about it and what it means. Okay, so the screening cells that we use, they're reagents. You guys saw a picture of them, gosh, in lectures 2 and 3 a while ago when we did our overview of blood banking reagents. And so they come in sets of 2 or 3 vials. Remember, they always have to be from a group O person, because we do not want any naturally occurring anti-A or anti-B to link up with our screening cells, okay? We want to eliminate those reactions because we just want to detect unexpected antibodies, okay? Okay, so I already said that. Come in sets of 2 or 3 vials, and then each vial comes from a donor and it's been phenotyped. So hopefully you remember what phenotyping means. They've tested to see which antigens are present and are not present on each donor vial cell, and that's listed on something called the antigram, and we've looked at that before. We will look at it again. So there are 18 antigens that are required on at least one of the vials. So our Rh antigens that we've talked about, big D, big C, big E, little e, MNSS, which we recently talked about, P1, the Lewis's, big K, little k, Kells, Okay, JKA and JKB, don't be confused. They're KID, Duffy A, and Duffy B. And sometimes they will also have like additional KELs like KPA and KPB, maybe JSA and JSB as well. So we already established previously that screening cells come with a sheet of paper called an antigram. The antigram is going to list all of the antigens that are present on each file and then also the ones that are not. When we test our patient and they have a reaction to one or more cells, this indicates the presence of an atypical or unexpected antibody, not naturally occurring anti-A or anti-B, something else that an individual has formed either from previous transfusion or pregnancy. Once we know that an individual has this unexpected antibody, our work is not done. So the purpose of the antibody screen is just to determine yes or no. Does the person have any unexpected antibodies? If they don't, great news, no more work, okay? If they do, we need to move on then and do further testing to identify the antibody or antibodies through panel testing. And so what I can say to you all is that when an individual has had transfusions as part of their history, it's entirely possible not just to have one unexpected antibody, but to have multiple antibodies. The more transfusions, the more likely that is. So here we see a picture of an antigram from our textbook. And this antigram, we've looked at it before. It happens to have 2 vials of cells, and so you can see why it's so important to know that Wiener classification. That's how they're designated here. And so as we've discussed previously, if I look across here, this antigram tells me which antigens are present. This one has big D and big C, no big E, no little c, has little e, so on and so forth. And when we're actually doing the antibody screen, many labs, they give you a bunch of these antigrams. Many times people are just going to record the phases of testing directly on the antigram itself. And so I typed in the phases of testing. So we would test an immediate spin, okay? Both tubes, record our results. So maybe I get negative and negative. I'm not done. Then I'm going to add a potentiator like LynnC for instance. Incubate those tubes at 37, spin and read them again, and then record the results under 37. Maybe they're still negative. I'm not done. My next phase of testing is AHG, and you guys know we have to wash 3 times with saline before we add our AHG. So we would wash both of these tubes with saline 3 times, then add our 2 drops of AHG, and spin and read. Okay, if I get let's say I get a negative with 1 cell, I'm going to move on and do the check cells. Okay, let's say I get a 1+ with screening cell 2, then I wouldn't have to do the check cells. Okay, but what that means is, my patient has an antibody that's reacting with some antigen that's present on screening cell 2 only, but not reacting with screening cell 1. Okay, so it gives me a clue. So the antigen would be present on screening cell 2, maybe like a big E as you see here on screening cell 2 and not on screening cell 1. Okay, we need to do more work to figure out exactly what it is, but it means that they do have an unexpected antibody in that case. So you've seen this picture before. This is a picture that I took in the good old days, 2018. When we had labs, and so here you can see the vials. We use screening cell. We just used 2 vials, and so there's a screening cell 1 and a screening cell 2, and this is the antigram that came with them. Okay, so the antigrams are going to be different depending on the lot number that you receive, and so we can see, people would be writing immediate spin 37 AHG check cells. They'd be recording directly on that antigram. Okay, their reactions. Or sometimes they have a log book or a worksheet they use too. You all have seen this picture before as well. So this is an example of an angiogram for a set of 3 screening cells. And so we see 1, 2, 3 here listed. And just like before, the antigram tells us which antigens are present or missing on each one. So difference here is when you look at screening cell 3, you can see that this is an Rh negative cell. Okay, and so there's 2 that are Rh positive and 1 that's Rh negative. Excuse me. And then you can see here, for instance, as I mentioned to you guys before with the cal antigens, in addition to big K and little k, they also have KPA, KPB, JSA, and JSB, okay, and some other ones. And you can see here, they recorded some results. So they skipped immediate spin, and they basically just have an AHG phase here. They incubated at 37 with PEG and moved right on to AHG and recorded their results here. And so we can see with this person that they did not react with screening cell 1. They got negative reaction, so they went on and did the check cells just to make sure that they added the AHG and the AHG was functioning and the wash step was done appropriately, all that good stuff. And we can see, though, the patient reacted 3+ with screening cell 2, and once again, no reaction with screening cell 3. So we can look at this example and say, let me find my pen. I'm going to try a different way to do this, right? I can use my pen and we can say, okay, well, this patient reacted with something that is present only on, sorry, I'm not coloring very well today. I thought this would make it look, maybe not. Only with screening cell 3, okay? Let me get my eraser, erase a little bit. I erased all of it. Okay, well, you guys get the idea. Okay, let me get back to my pen. Okay, so what could it be? You know, when we look here, it has to be something that's only on screening cell 2 and not on 1 and not on 3. And so we can see right here, right away, that here's some it could be. And we don't know until we do the panel testing, okay? This is on all 3, all 3, all 3, 2, here's some, okay? So whatever this patient has, their antibodies only reacting with antigens present on screening cell 2, so I hope you get what I'm doing. I'm looking for cells where screening cell 2 has the antigen, but 1 and 3 don't, to match this pattern of reactivity, just to get an idea of what it could be. This one. LEA. Well, that one doesn't usually react at 37 though. 1. We wouldn't really know until we do the panel testing, and so we could see, okay, big S. All right. So that looks like it's about it. So I wish I could see you guys. Everybody, does that make sense? Okay, so could be an antibody against big C or E, which is only on screening cell 2. It could be an antibody against Duffy B, maybe, or JKA, which are only on screening cell 2. LEA, probably not. That one usually reacts only at room temp. P1, probably not. Okay, or big S. Okay, and so the purpose, or how we would figure out the rest of this would be our panel testing. Okay, so we'll move next. Okay, so another important part of our antibody identification is running what we call an auto control, which many labs also call the patient control. So those two things mean the same thing. Now, we've talked about the patient control before when we were doing some of our testing. And basically, the patient control, we are testing the patient's serum or plasma with their own red cells. We want to make sure that they're not already agglutinating, okay? So whenever we run an antibody screen or an antibody panel, we want to run the auto control along with our screening cells or our panel cells and carry it through all phases of testing, okay? All right. So if we run, and so basically it's 2 drops of the patient's serum or plasma in a tube with their own, with 1 drop of their own 3 to 5% red blood cells. So if we test our auto control with our antibody screen and it's positive, that's telling us that the patient's cells are already agglutinating. We want to try to figure out why. So we want to follow up and do a direct antiglobulin test, okay? And so remember, the direct antiglobulin test detects sensitization which occurred where? Anybody? Hopefully you're saying it to yourself. I think I like the pen from this better than the pen from in vivo. Okay, so these cells may be coated with something already, some antibody. Okay, and this happened in the patient. So the direct antiglobulin test, we're just going to take a drop of the patient's 3 to 5% red cells, wash them 3 times, add the AHG centrifuge and read. It was already there. See, I didn't even need it. So the auto control or the patient control and the DAT can help us to determine if the antibodies are directed against the patient's own cells or maybe transfused cell, whether ALO or auto antibody. And we'll be looking more at that in the future. Okay. So we already talked a little bit about potentiators already. So remember, potentiators are reagents that can enhance weak antigen-antibody interactions, and there are quite a few that can be used in the lab. So LynnC, low ionic strength solution, is a common one. That's the one that we use in our lab. We can also use bovine serum albumin. PEG, polyethylene glycol, was used on the example that we looked at. And then we run into our proteolytic enzymes, okay? And so proteolytic enzymes like physin and papain can be used to treat red blood cells before we test those reagent red cells with our patient plasma or serum, okay? And so this is a review from last time. I want you to think, it's very important to remember, which antigens are destroyed if we enzyme treat the red cells. Think of one, yell it out. Hopefully you remember. Duffy. And, this is tricky, M and N, okay? So these are antigens that are destroyed. Now there are others that are enhanced. Anybody remember? RH, KID, Lewis. All right, so that's about it. Okay, so this is table 8.1 from our textbook, which just does a review of some of the potentiators that we talked about. And each one of them has their own maybe reason why we'd want to use it, but none of them are completely perfect. So sometimes there are some other things that can occur. So there, as I guess I could say, there are pros and cons to each. And so here you can see a review of the enzyme treatment. And so as we said, the Duffys and M&N are definitely destroyed. And then enhanced RH, KID, Lewis, P1, which I did not write. Okay, so just a good review. All right, so how do we interpret our antibody screen results? Okay, so remember, we're doing 3 phases of testing: immediate spin, 37, and AHG. If my patient has negative reactions at all 3 phases of testing with all of my screening cells, they do not have an unexpected antibody, and there is no need to do any further testing. Okay, they're good. Okay, tubes that are carried through all phases of testing, or I should say tubes are carried through all phases of testing, as I mentioned to you guys before, regardless if they're positive early on. Okay, we're going to see why in a few minutes. A positive reaction at any phase of testing indicates that this person has at least one unexpected antibody. Okay, and so that's why we do not stop. Okay, why is that? If we have screening cells that react at only room temperature, immediate spin, this indicates an IgM class antibody. It's most likely not going to impact transfusion, but if I got a positive at immediate spin, I don't want to stop. I want to keep going because I need to see if they have something that would be clinically significant, an IgG that's reacting at either 37 and or AHG. Okay, so that's why we always carry through the tubes through all three stages of testing or phases of testing. And if we do identify that our patient has an unexpected antibody, remember, they may just react with one screening cell. They don't have to react with all of them. Reacting with one is enough. We need to follow up with panel testing to identify their antibody or antibodies. So this is a nice table from our textbook, and let me see if I can find the name of it for you, or the number. It's not on there for some reason. It's figure 8.2, okay, if you want to look at it in the textbook. This is really nice because it shows some initial testing and some tentative interpretations, what these results could possibly mean. So we're going to take a few minutes and review these. Okay, and before we get started, what I will say is for each one of these examples 1 through 5, we have a patient where they performed an antibody screen, and they had 3 screening cells that they tested, and then they also did a direct antiglobulin test. Okay, now something I want to reinforce with you all is that whenever a direct antiglobulin test is done, it should always be performed on an EDTA, on red cells from an EDTA anticoagulated tube. Okay, so you might say, well, I thought blood bank only was done on EDTA anticoagulated tubes. And most places, for this reason, prefer to use either the pink or lavender EDTA tube for all testing. However, it's entirely possible to do testing on a plain red top tube, allow it to clot, separate the serum, test the serum and the cells separately. However, for DAT testing, testing on a serum tube is a big no-no because clotted tubes can lead to false positive reactions with C3, okay, our monospecific C3 anti-human globulin reagent, okay, can be activated. So we don't want to do DAT from a clot tube. So let's begin with number 1. So we see immediate spin testing results. 0 means negative, no reactions. Good so far. All 3 tubes, all 3 screening cells at 37, no reactions. Then once we get to our AHG phase, we see that we have a 2+ reaction here with screening cell 2. Okay, so guess what? Reacting with 1 is good enough. It means something's going on here. The fact that this is only reacting at AHG makes us want to think this is a class IgG antibody, and it would be clinically significant, okay, because it's reacting at AHG. So they went ahead and did the DAT. So we always start with polyspecific anti-human globulin test, and basically the poly was negative and they did check cells and everything checked out. So there was really no need. This NT means not tested. There was no need to test monospecific IgG and C3 because this was negative. Okay. The reason why they would go and move on and do the monospecific would be to see, okay, like if we got a positive with poly, okay, what's making it positive? Is it IgG coding those cells or C3? All right. So because we're getting negative reactions with the DAT, think about what the DAT detects. Sensitization in vivo. So a DAT would be positive when there is some immunoglobulin coding the patient's red cells. Okay, and in this case there is not. So they have not had an autoimmune reaction. They have not had a transfusion reaction. You know, there is no sensitization. So this is simply telling us they have an ALO antibody because nothing is showing up here. It's class IgG because it's only reacting at AHG. And we suspect they just have one antibody because, you know, it's only showing up reacting with one of our screening cells. Okay, so no multiple antibodies, just one. We move on to our second example. We see once again negative results all through immediate spin. We look at our 37 degree C here, and we can see that there is a 1+ reaction only with screening cell 3. When we move on to AHG, we see some additional reactions cropping up. So now we have a 2+ with screening cell 1, a 1+ with screening cell 2, and the reaction with screening cell 3 has intensified and gotten stronger. And that typically happens when we have a reaction that starts at 37. It will often become stronger with AHG because remember, AHG enhances reactions. Okay, so these look clinically significant. Anything reacting at 37 and or AHG is clinically significant, and we want to say it's IgG. Okay, so they went ahead once again, they did the DAT, they tested with polyspecific, got a negative result, check cells were good, no need to test with the monospecific. So this means that sensitization did not happen in vivo, there is no autoantibody, there is no recent transfusion reaction, okay? And so basically, this is an example of, once again, an ALO antibody directed against other people's antigens, and we're going to say multiple specificities. So why do we say multiple specificities? When you see different patterns of reaction like we do here, so screening cell 3, started at 1+, got much stronger at 3+. Then these, how come these didn't react here? They're just showing up reacting, with screening cell 1 and 2 only at the AHG. It looks like different patterns of reactivity, so we're going to suspect that this person has more than one antibody. So one of them is starting at 37, getting stronger at AHG. This one is only reacting at AHG. You might say, well, how come it's 2+ with cell 1 and only 1+ with cell 2? And what we can say here is this may be an ALO antibody that is reacting more strongly with screening cell 1 due to dosage. Remember dosage? Dosage says that some antibodies will react more strongly when their target antigen is inherited in a homozygous expression. Okay? So let's move on to example 3. So this example is a little bit different than the first two because when we look at this example, we can see that we have 1+ reactions with all three screening cells showing up in immediate spin. We also see that by the time we get to 37 degrees, all of the reactions are gone. They're now negative and remain negative at AHG, so check cells were done. Okay, so our initial impression here is, since we only had reactivity showing up at immediate spin, that this is a clinically insignificant antibody. Did not carry over to human body temperature of 37, and we want to suspect that this is IgM because IgM reacts best at room temperature or colder typically. They went ahead and did a DAT, and once again with the polyspecific, there was no reaction. So we suspect a single specificity of IgM, not an autoantibody, an ALO antibody directed against other. They're not going to worry about this one as far as transfusion because since it failed to react at 37 in AHG, it's not going to have an impact on any transfusions. Example 4, once again, we see our reactions are popping up here at immediate spin, and they are gone by the time we get to 37 in AHG. Okay, so it looks very similar to our last example, and similar to that, we're going to suspect an IgM, okay, that's reacting only at immediate spin. So we call IgM cold because 37 is warmer. This one is different because when they did the DAT with the polyspecific, we're now getting a 1+ reaction with the polyspecific, so they went ahead and tested separately anti-IgG and anti-complement. Okay, and so we see that the IgG was a negative reaction, and so basically what this result tells us is complement. Since that is the positive one, complement is what is coding this person's cells. Okay, we're going to call this an autoantibody because we're getting a reaction on the DAT. Okay, so basically sensitization has happened in vivo. Complement is coding this person's cells. We're going to call it cold because it only reacts at immediate spin. We're going to say class IgM, so this is a cold autoantibody. And our last example, nothing at immediate spin, nothing at 37, and then we see 2+ reactions with all 3 of our screening cells popping up at AHG. So remember, reactions at 37 or AHG, they are significant, and we're going to say it's class IgG. Went ahead and did the DAT. Polyspecific is 2+. They went ahead and tested separately monospecific IgG, where they got the same 2+ reaction. Monospecific complement was negative. So this tells us that IgG is what is coding this person's cells. So one explanation for this is a warm autoantibody, warm reacting only at AHG phase, it's IgG. They're saying auto because the DAT was positive. I'm going to put out there to you guys that could also be, we could get these same results right after a transfusion reaction. Okay, so if this person was recently transfused and their screen now is popping up positive with this positive DAT. Remember, DAT just tells us sensitization has happened in vivo. So another explanation could be a transfusion reaction with a warm reacting class IgG as well, if they were recently transfused. Okay, so look those over. They are important. So patient history is extremely important when we're trying to figure out what is going on with a positive antibody screen or DAT. So knowing if the patient has had a transfusion recently is really critical because red cells from a donor that a person was transfused with can live for up to 3 months. That's 90 days. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you guys because we know from hematology that average red cells live 120, so it would make sense that donor red cells from a transfusion could live up to 3 months. So there could be a mixed population of red cells there. Sometimes this can be difficult because patients are sometimes transferred, let's say from a community hospital to a trauma center. So the example I can give, you know, Jefferson area is in Northeast Philadelphia. Maybe a person was there, got a transfusion, and then, you know, needed to be transferred to a critical care like a Jefferson or a UPenn or a Temple or Einstein or something else. And so, you know, we may not know exactly what happened to that patient at their previous hospital. Some diseases that individuals have are associated with antibodies, namely autoimmune diseases, making antibodies directed against self. We know from our last unit, lecture 9, that certain antibodies occur at a higher frequency in some races. And so the example here, I'm going to test you guys. I wish I could see your answers. Let's say we determine that somebody has an anti-big U. Remember that one? We know that U is a high frequency antigen. And so when someone lacks the U antigen and makes an antibody against it, we know it's associated with blacks, okay, because other races and ethnic backgrounds, it's like 99.9% positive, so knowing someone race can play in, okay? So learning about diagnosis, age, and race of the patient can be helpful in figuring out what is going on. All right, so we finished detection. Now we're going to move on to identification. So once we know that our antibody screen is positive, we're going to move on and we're going to test that very same patient with panel red blood cells. And so the antibody panel is really an extended version of the screen. So the antibody screen we saw can have 2 or 3 vials of reagent red cells. The panel can have anywhere from 10 to 20 reagent red cells. Some of the rules are the same. There's still going to be group O cells, and we want to have a variety of antigens expressed on those cells. And they come from the company, the manufacturer, with the phenotype on an antigram, okay, just like the screen does. So this is really just an extension of a screen. When we're doing panel testing to identify antibodies, we want to use the same potentiator that we used in the screen. So what does this mean? If we used PEG when we were doing our antibody screen, we want to use PEG when we're doing the panel, okay? And always remember, at AHG phase, any negative reaction must be confirmed with check cells. Okay. We're also going to run our auto control along with the panel, okay, which means the same thing as patient control, okay? So a positive autocontrol, or DAT, indicates the patient has an autoantibody or an ALO antibody to recently transfused cells. Negative autocontrol, along with a positive screener panel, indicates the person has an ALO antibody, but it's not attached to any red cells in their body at this point, okay? Positive autocontrol and a negative DAT is a mismatch. This indicates there's a false positive reaction, and usually it has to do with potentiator used in testing. So, when we run the autocontrol, we're testing patient serum or plasma with patient red cells, and we're using the same potentiator that we use in the screen and the panel. And so maybe there's a cross reaction in this autocontrol with the potentiator that we use, that PEG or LynnC or albumin, because these two should really always be the same, either both negative or both positive. All right? We're still going to run through our 3 phases of testing for us. So remember, our IgM antibodies react to cooler temperatures, room temperature during immediate spin. And to review from last time, some important ones to remember that are typically IgM, the Lewis's, anti-LEA, anti-LEB, anti-big M, anti-big N, anti-big I, and anti-P1, okay? They would only be considered clinically significant if their reactions carried through to 37 degrees. So what does this mean? Maybe when we do our immediate spin testing, they're testing like 2+. And then maybe when we move to 37 degrees, if they carry through to 37 as a 1+ or a plus weak, then we have to consider them that they could potentially have an impact on a transfusion because they're reacting at human body temperature. IgG typically reacts at 37 or with AHG, and reactions at different phases may indicate somebody has both IgM and IgG classes. All right, so here's a couple of rules with our 3 phases. So remember, immediate spin, you add everything to the tube, you centrifuge, you read. I want to tell you guys again, many clinical labs do not do immediate spin testing. They don't bother because they're picking up on IgM antibodies that are only reacting at immediate spin, and they're nuisances. So why aren't they going to test? Because if it's not reacting at 37, why do I even need to know about it? And once I know about it, then I have to identify it. Okay, so, and it really doesn't have an impact on transfusion unless it's reacting at 37 degrees or AHG. And so here we see the antibody specificities listed from the previous page. When we have reactions at 37 degrees with our potentiator, there is a possibility it could be a cold antibody, something that started at immediate spin and the reaction is carrying through. And so typically, what that would be is my example before. Maybe it's like 2+ at immediate spin, and then when I get to 37 degrees with my potentiator, it's like a 1+ or even a plus weak, which is a very, very weak reaction. Okay, that's when we're going to suspect that it's IgM. If the 37-degree reaction is the first time we're seeing the reaction, it did not start at immediate spin, then we're going to suspect it's an IgG warm antibody. Okay? And so our IgG warm antibodies, if they do start at 37, will typically get stronger at AHG. However, don't be fooled. Sometimes an IgG warm antibody may be negative at 37 degrees, but is, because it's a weak reacting antibody in vitro, but then when we get to AHG, that's when we're detecting it. That's entirely possible as well. So our interpretation guidelines. We want to look at reaction strengths. So when we have reactions with varying strengths, it may indicate there's more than one antibody, or it could be the effect of dosage. Okay, and we talked a little bit about that before. So when we're looking at our panel, there are a couple of rules, and so what I'm going to do is talk about the rules first and bear with it, and then we're going to do an example together, which is really going to, I think, make everything crystal. Okay, so we on the panel antigram, we're going to record our results just like we would on the antibody screen antigram, and so we're going to only look at panel cells. Remember, the panel cells are in a row, right? We're only going to look at panel cells that test negative with my patient in all phases. So if I'm doing immediate, that means if I'm doing immediate spin, 37 with potentiator and AHG needs to be negative at all three, okay? And we're going to use those cells to help us rule out or exclude certain antibodies, okay? So we're going to start with the first panel cell that has tested negative in all three phases, and we're going to look at the antigram, and we're going to cross out any antigens that are positive for that panel cell. Because think about it, what it means is if my patient didn't react with that panel cell, and there are certain antigens present on that cell, it means that their antibody is not reacting to those antigens because it's negative. Okay, so that's why we can eliminate. We do want to consider dosage for certain groups. So for instance, we know dosage is heterozygous inheritance of two antithetical alleles. We don't want to cross them out if we know it's a system that is affected by dosage, like Duffy, for instance. Because maybe if it's a heterozygous cell, like let's say Duffy A is positive, let's say they're Duffy A positive and Duffy B positive, right? And let's say my patient has an anti-Duffy A, right? They're going to have less expression of Duffy A on a cell that has both, okay? And so maybe the antibody isn't reacting with this cell because it's heterozygous, okay? So we do want to consider dosage, and I think when we go through an example, that's going to make sense as well. There is an exception to the rule that we don't have to worry about dosage with, and these are the KEL antigens. They can be ruled out when they're heterozygous because they're really not affected by dosage. So we're going to continue doing this same process only for panel cells that have tested negative in all phases of testing. So this slide you've seen before from lectures 2 and 3, but this is a picture I took once again in the good old days, 2018, when we were able to have lab. But here we see, excuse me, some panel cells. And so there's basically 10 panel cells, and this one is usually called test cell, TC. And we see the antigram that goes along with each one of the cells. So when I'm doing the testing, I would basically have a tube for 1 through 10, and maybe I'm going to test this one too. That would be my 11th tube. I'm going to test my patient control or auto control. That will be the 12th tube. And so to set up the testing, I would add 2 drops of my patient's plasma into all 12 tubes, and then 1 drop of screening cell 1 goes into tube 1. I'm sorry, panel cell 1 into tube 1, panel cell 2 into tube 2, so on and so forth. I could record immediate spin on a column here. As soon as I add everything, I'm going to centrifuge them and read them. And I'm going to record negative, or if they're positive, grade the reactions. Then I'm going to add my potentiator. We happen to do LynnC, so I'd add LynnC to all 12 tubes, incubate them at 37 for a minimum of 15 minutes, centrifuge and read, and then I'm going to record in a column that I would have labeled 37-degree LynnC. We're getting ready for AHG next, so you know the drill. I would take all 12 tubes, put them in the cell washer, wash them 3 times. Then I'm going to go and add my polyspecific AHG, 1 drop to each tube, centrifuge and read, and record those results in that column. And then to any tube that tests negative with AHG, I'm going to do check cells. So I would add a drop of check cells to my negative tubes, centrifuge them, grade my check cell reactions, and then I would have everything filled out on the angiogram. So you can see this takes some time. It's not like something that's done in 10 minutes. So this is an example from our textbook that we will use to practice doing the rule out method. Okay? And I'm going to get my pen. Okay. So remember the rules. Okay, so here we see they wrote all the reactions. So immediate spin was all negative. 37-degree was all negative, but then at AHG, a couple of cells became positive. And what's nice is this is from our textbook, so they sort of helped us out as to which cells we could use for the elimination method. So remember, I can't use cell 1 to help me eliminate antigens on that cell because my patient reacted with this cell, 2+. So I can't use this one. It had a positive reaction. And so basically, if there was a positive reaction at any phase of testing, I can't use that cell, okay? So the very first, or the very next cell, cell 2, we could see that negative at IS, 37 in AHG, the only positive reaction, which was check cells, is confirming my negative AHG. So this is the first cell that I can use to eliminate antigens, okay? So remember, here's the thinking behind it. Since my patient did not react, my patient's antibody did not react with the antigens on this cell, number 2, I can go over here and eliminate antigens that are positive on this cell because I know they didn't react with my patient. All right? And so I like to do it so I can eliminate the big D. And then I like to do it up here too. Okay, but then I know which cell I eliminated big D on. Can I eliminate big C? I do want to consider dosage for big C. So if little c happened to be there, I would not be able to, but it's not. So I can eliminate big C. That one didn't cause this. Okay. I can't do anything with big E. I can't eliminate it because it's not present. And same with little c. Can't eliminate that one either. Then when I get to little e, I can eliminate this. I see that it's a double shot of little e because the big E isn't there. So I'm going to get rid of that one. Cross it off. And I can't do anything with F. CW, I can get rid of. Remember, that's a very rare antigen, but I can get rid of that one. Okay? So just remember, since there are no reactions here, I can eliminate antigen positive antigens from this cell because they did not react with my patient's antibody. But I want to consider dosage. Okay? So M and N are antithetical to each other. I can eliminate the M because the N is not there. So let me get rid of M. Can I eliminate N? No, it's not there. And same thing with S. I can't eliminate S because it is not there. Can I eliminate little s? Absolutely. And so it's antithetical to big S, but it's like a double shot of little s because this cell doesn't have the big S. P1 stands alone. I can get rid of that one. LEB, I can get rid of. LUB, I can get rid of. When it comes to the KELs, it's very hard for like big K to find that one well, we don't always do dosage for Kel. That's what I'm going to say, but I can get rid of little k. Okay. I can get rid of Duffy B because the Duffy A isn't there. And with the kid, this is a good example. They're both there. So I am not going to eliminate either one of them due to dosage. And so I wrote an example up here. So, you know, you've seen me do this before. So, you know, in the example of cell 2, JKA and JKB are both taking up space on the red cell membrane. So there's less expression of both of them compared to, for instance, if only JKA was inherited. We see it's like a double shot of the antigen. So anything, you know, that is heterozygous like this, we're going to skip. Okay? Okay, so we've done everything we can do with cell 2. So which cell are we going to use to help eliminate antigens next? It is not going to be cell 3 because we see cell 3 has a positive reaction there. So that means we don't want to use this cell 3 to eliminate antigens because this cell reacted with my patient's antibody. Excuse me. So we're going to move on to cell 4. Negative here, eliminate positive over here. Now here's the thing. If I have previously eliminated an antigen, I don't have to re-eliminate it. It's gone. I don't even need to look at it. So I just want to look at things that are left. I can't do anything with big E. It's not there. Can I eliminate little c? Dun, 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 the million-dollar question. If I'm considering dosage, no, because big C is there. Okay? This was already eliminated. I can get rid of the F, that compound antigen. And I'm going to move over to N. Can't do anything with it. It's not there. Can I eliminate big S? If I'm considering dosage, no, I have to skip it. Okay? No LEA, no LUA, no big K. Duffy A? Yeah, Duffy B's not there, so I'm going to get rid of this. And I still can't do anything with the JKs. Okay? So we're going to move on. The very next cell, cell 5, is completely negative as well. So we're going to go over, and we're first going to look at E. Okay. Now, if I'm considering dosage, I really want to skip the big E, okay, because the little e is there. When I look at little c, however, I can get rid of that one because the big C is absent. Okay? Now, I don't need to do the ones I already did, so I'm going to go over to N. Can I do the N? If I'm taking dosage into consideration, I can. Can I do the S? No, for the same reason. No LEA, no LUA, no big K. JKs, looks like I can get rid of JKA. So let's get rid of that one. Okay. And the very next cell, cell 6, tested completely negative. So we're going to use that one to try to help us out. No biggie, can't get rid of that. Okay. And then we're going to move to N. Still can't get rid of that. Still can't get rid of big S due to dosage. I can get rid of LEA. Nothing with LUA. Nothing with big K. JKB, no, because JKA is there. So we have a couple more cells we can look at. Can I use cell 7 to help me eliminate things? No, because patient reacted. Okay, so we're going to move on to cell 8, which tested completely negative at each phase of testing. Still can do nothing with big E. Okay, so we're going to go until we get to N. N is not there, can't. Big S, no, due to dosage. LUA, no. Big K, no. JKB, yes, well, at least we got one out of that. Okay, now we're going to move to 9. Still can't do anything with E. Nothing with N. Nothing with big S. I'll jump over to K. Nope. Okay, nope. And then we only have one cell left. So here, nope, can't do anything with big E. We can finally get rid of N. Okay. And big S because The antitheticals aren't there, so that was good to get rid of 2 of those. Nope, no LUA, no big K. Okay, so that's basically all we can do. But you can see that, and you can see how the patient tested completely negative, but that doesn't really help us for ruling out. So we have a few specificities that are left, and I want to change my pen color to something else now. Let's see. I'll go for blue. All right. So the ones that are left, we have big E. Oh God, this is, sorry guys, I'm having a really hard time drawing a straight line. We have LUA, and this is an interesting one when we look at this. This is all how good you are with your mouse, and I'm not being very good right now. We have big K. It's hard enough to do with a pen, let alone with a mouse. Bear with me. Okay, and those are the 3 that we have left. So what we're going to learn on another slide, maybe I'm going to jump ahead and come back to this. Okay, so bear with it for now. Okay, so we've used negative reacting cells and eliminated positive reactions on those cells. So we did the first step. Now we're at step 2 where we're going to match the pattern. So for the antigens that were not crossed off, we're going to look at the column for the antigen. And so basically we want to see if the pattern of positive and negative reactions my patient had with testing match any of the positive and negative presence of the antigen with the columns that are left vertically, okay, that have not been excluded. And when we do this, it's going to make a lot more sense. So when an individual only has one antibody, the pattern should match one of the remaining antigen columns, okay? When an individual has more than one antibody, it's not so cut and dry. There could be varying patterns, and they usually don't fit one antigen column. And these are instances where we would have to do additional testing, maybe with enzyme-treated cells, or use some of the sulfhydryl reagent to eliminate Kel antigens, or things like that to try to figure out what the patient has. Okay, so this is where we are, step 2, pattern matching. And I'm going to go back, and even though it looks bad, we're going to look at the ones that are left, which I outlined in blue. Okay, so what I want to do, we're going to start with big E, and we're going to go down this way vertically, and we want to see, so what we're looking for is if E, let's say that the patient had an anti-E, they should not then have reacted with cells 1 or 2 because the E antigen isn't there, and they should have reacted with cell 3, and not with cell 4, but react with cell 5, and then not with any of the remaining cells. So we want negative over here to match negative reactions with our testing, and positive reactions over here to match positive reactions with our testing. So let's look. So first 2 cells don't have E antigen. So if this were the antibody, we would expect to have negative reactions with cells 1 and 2. And we see that we don't. Okay, so this is already a mismatch because our patient reacted strongly with cell 1 and E antigen wasn't there. So if this was anti-E, it would have nothing to react with. So that's already doesn't match. We could see here that cell 3 happened to be a match. This matches, but then, you know, the antigen is here and negative reactions and then all these negatives, and there's a strong one here and there's no antigen. So we can eliminate E. It's not E. The pattern doesn't match. So let's go to the next one we have. We have LUA. Now, this is very interesting. Let's look at LUA. Negative. So here's the thing. LUA can't, hard to write, can't be excluded based on our testing, an antibody to that, because the antigen is not represented on the panel. Okay, and so we know that typically anti-LUA is rare anyway, and usually is IgM, so we're not going to worry about it. But does everybody see? I can't say anything about whether my patient has an antibody against LUA because the LUA antigen is not present on any of these cells for my patient to react to. So we say cannot exclude, okay, because we have negatives, no antigen. And remember, when we see a pattern like this for a given antigen column and it's not represented on any of our panel cells, we want to think that it is a low frequency antigen, one that is not common, not commonly seen, okay? So this is a low frequency antigen. We can't say anything about my patient having an antibody against it because there's nothing for it to react to. All right. So that leaves us with big K. So let's see what we have. All right. So big K, antigen is positive on cell 1, and my patient reacted. No K antigen on cell 2, and patient didn't react. It's starting to fit. Cell 3, K antigen is positive, and my patient reacted 2+. That's a fit. Negative, negative. No K antigen on the next 3 cells, and patient didn't react with those 3 cells. And then for cell 7, we see K antigen is present again, and my patient reacted. And then the last 3 cells, no K antigen, and patient didn't react. This is an example of the pattern, folks, okay? This completely fits, and hopefully it makes sense to you why, okay? So patient reacted with K antigen positive cells and did not react with K antigen negative cells, so it's looking like my patient has an antibody against the big K. So we can say we think this is, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, anti big K. All right. So before we move away from this, I want to talk about a couple more things. All right. So you might say, okay, well, I can see that, the patient reacted with the 3 antigen positive cells, but why did my patient react more strongly with cell 7 than with cells 3 or 1? And when we look at, and we know that usually Kel doesn't show dosage, so it's not the greatest textbook example here. But when we look, we can see that cell 7 happens to have a double shot of K, and maybe that's why this is a little bit stronger, whereas cells 1 and 3 were heterozygous, and that might be why there was a weaker reaction. But we usually don't consider dosage when we're eliminating K in the panel. Okay, so it looks like anti-big K. There's a couple of other things we can do to prove this is really anti-big K. And basically one of the things we can do, and this is coming up on a future slide, we can phenotype our patient's red cells. So remember, panel, we're using their plasma to look for unexpected antibodies. If our patient has an ALO anti-K, okay, an anti-K directed against, the K antigen, we could take known anti-sera, just like we do in forward typing when we test the patient's red cells with anti-A and anti-B. It's called phenotyping. We can phenotype our patient, okay, patient red cells. Phenotype, I can't do this, this is really hard. Phenotype our patient's RBCs using anti-K, and guess what? They should be K antigen negative. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. They should be lacking the K antigen. Why? How did they ever form this anti-K? They must have had a transfusion or a pregnancy and been exposed to donor or fetal red cells that had K antigen. And their body said, hey, I don't have K antigen. I'm going to make an antibody against it. And that's how their anti-K was formed. So phenotyping this patient's red cells, using known anti-K anti-sera, the patient's red cells should not agglutinate with that anti-K anti-serum, meaning be negative for the K antigen, and it kind of is just a double check that anti-K is the one, and hopefully that makes sense. my messy writing. Okay, so that's what matching the pattern is all about. So there are some other important rules we have to talk about that really are going to ensure that the antibody or antibodies that we think are the ones the patient has is not a random event, and that it really holds true statistically. This has to do with something called a p-value. So the p-value is the probability that an event is not random, and the p-value must be at 0.05 or less to guarantee that it's not a random event. So this p-value of 0.05 or less is met if we have at least 3 antigen positive cells that reacted with our patient, and at least 3 antigen negative cells that do not react with the patient. And so this is why it's called the rule of 3. Okay, now you can certainly have more than 3, okay, but we need to have at least 3 positives that react and 3 antigen negatives that don't, to prove that it's not a random event. If we do not have enough cells in the panel to meet the rule of 3 for either the number of positives or the number of negatives, we need to test cells from other panels, select specific cells, and test them to provide the needed positive or negative reactions. We could also go back to our antibody screen and use some of those reactions, for instance, if need be. Okay, so let's go back and look at our panel. It's crazy. So let's see, was our rule of 3 met? Do we have at least 3 antigen positive cells that reacted with our patient? And so we have 1, 2, 3. So we just made it with our positives, right? We definitely have at least 3 antigen negatives that did not react. We have quite a few. We actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we could say that yes, the rule of 3 was met. So this is not a random event, and it's highly likely that anti-K is the antibody. Okay, so this is the example that we just did, and this is our textbook company. They must have ruled out E on a heterozygous cell. That's the only thing I can tell you. And so basically, what's important here is showing, okay, the reactions, which we did together, and LUA. They're also bearing me out on that, can't be ruled out because it's not represented. And so they are saying that this cell reacted more strongly because it's homozygous, as we talked about. Okay, so mentioned to you guys a few minutes ago that another thing we can do is phenotype our patient using anti-sera that correspond to the antibody we suspect they have. And so it's just a way to confirm the presence of a specific antibody, you know, by determining the patient's red cell phenotype. So individuals do not make ALO antibodies towards antigens on their own red cells. So our patient would not have anti-big K if they had K antigen. So phenotyping, in our case, we're going to take the anti-K and we're going to add a drop of the patient's 3 to 5% red cells, and it should not agglutinate, and that's going to confirm that that they really do have anti-K. It's another way to do it. So it's known anti-sera. Okay. If the patient has been recently transfused, we do not want to phenotype them, and hopefully this makes sense. Phenotyping, we're using their red cells. If the patient was recently transfused, they have more than one population of red cells in their circulation. They have their own, and they also have donor cells, and so we could get misleading results. So we don't want to phenotype someone who's been recently transfused, and if we're going to try to do that, we have to try to separate the red cells before we do that phenotyping. one other thing I want to talk about. So in our example, our patient has the anti-big K. Guess what? Hopefully this makes sense. If they need a transfusion of red cells, we want to make sure if they have anti-K, we should only give them K antigen negative RBCs, right? And hopefully that makes sense. Okay, and I apologize for the messy writing with this. We don't want to give them the antigen that corresponds to their antibody because they're going to have a transfusion reaction if we do that. Okay, so we would only want to provide them with K antigen negative red cells for future transfusions. Okay, so here we see table 8.3, which give us some guidelines for interpretation of a panel. And so this is good to just basically review because we've talked a lot about it already. We always want to run the patient control or the auto control along with the panel. And if the auto control is negative, it tells us ALO antibody, right? Directed against other. If that auto control is positive, could be an autoantibody or a drug interaction. Or it could be if they recently had a transfusion, it could be a delayed transfusion reaction where the transfused cells are coated with the antibody. We looked at reaction phases. So remember, things only reacting at room temperature or immediate spin are IgM and not clinically significant. When we see reactions at 37 degrees, it could be an IgM that's carrying through from room temperature to 37, or it could be a warm IgG, okay? And at AHG, it's a warm reacting IgG, which would be considered clinically significant. When we're looking at strengths of reaction, if there's only single strength reactions, it's probably only one antibody, not more than one. When we get varying strengths, there could be more than one antibody present, or it could be in our example where the antibody is reacting more strongly with certain cells based on dosage. So ruling out, we only use negative reactions, right, to eliminate antigens that are positive on our panel. So if no reaction was observed, the antibody was not, if no reaction was observed, the antibody to the antigen on the panel was probably not present. If the antigen on the panel is heterozygous, we don't want to eliminate, we want to use dosage for that. And we never want to use positive reacting cells for elimination purposes. So we want to match the pattern. With us, it was a single antibody, so it matched perfectly. We'll be doing some examples of multiple antibodies in the future. So when there is more than one, it can be tricky, and we can tell maybe if there are different reactions at different phases or different reaction strengths. Rule of 3 says we have to have 3 antigen positive cells react with my patient and 3 antigen negative cells that don't react. And then phenotyping our patient's red cells, we expect them to lack the antigen that corresponds to their own antibody. Okay. We're going to take a break there.